All right, Bob. Bob Debold. So hi. Uh, thanks for getting together again after a few years since the last time you shared some of your stories about your experiences with the Urantia book and studying the Urantia book with Sandra Bullock's father. And yeah, could you maybe share that story a little bit? Your experience with finding the Urantia book and studying it and all that.
Sure. Well, let me start before John, because I was in New Jersey at the time when I first came across the Urantia book. So I'll kind of preface the context with that. And then when I got down to Washington, D.C., I'm in Fairfax, Virginia right now. Um, I found John's group and was there for at least 15, 18 years or so that we were steadily going through the book. So back in New Jersey, I was a high school teacher. I taught math and had a very large homeroom. This was sometime around 1977 or so. No, I'm sorry, I take that back. It was more so like around 1974. I was moving into the Honeywell days there.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I was in a homeroom that had, just a very large one. There was two of us there, and the fella, we would meet in the morning and we'd try to get ready because we knew we had hundreds of kids that were going to show up, and we had to make sure that everything was contained and they were ready to go and ready to hear the notices, etc. I'm sure you probably know a little bit about that. So one morning, we talked about a lot of things, and one morning he said, "Bob, you seem to be searching for a lot of things." He said, "I have a friend who was on a train going to Turkey, and he was about to go and make a big drug deal. And on this train, he found this big blue book. And he said it changed his life. He turned around, he got off the train, and it completely changed his life." And I was a little skeptical of that. And I thought, okay, well, that's pretty interesting. How does a book do that? He said, well, this book says that Adam and Eve were 8 foot tall and purple. I said, oh, I got to get that book. So that's the statement that got me. And Bob brought the book in the next day, and I was off and running with it. So never really was interested in getting into a reading group. I know somebody suggested at one point because I was just reading by myself. More, I didn't know anybody else other than Bob who was reading, and he kind of wasn't really reading the book. He kind of sloughed it off a little bit.
Hmm.
That's kind of how these things happen. It goes from one to the next, and it gains some energy with the next person sometimes. So I got a job with Honeywell, and I was with the Federal Systems Division. I was in Bayonne, New Jersey, and they needed a site analyst to go to the Washington D.C. Site. So it was a great opportunity. They were going to move me to Washington D.C., so I decided to do that. Actually, the Virginia area. So I did that, and when I got to the headquarters, it was the Federal Division. There was probably 3,000 or so folks in there. Honeywell at the time had about 140,000 people. So this was a small division, but we were a very big revenue producer because we had all federal contracts. And I started moving up in the management ranks. And I would say that this was probably more about 82 or 83. And one of my manager associates, we were both field managers. His name was Floyd Lindsay. We got talking one day the same way that Bob Shemy and I did back in New Jersey, and he said almost the same thing. He said, "Bob, you seem like you're kind of searching for lots of things." He said, "I have this book that I had on my shelf," and he says, "It's this big blue book. It's called the Urantia Book. I haven't read it or anything." I said, "Oh my God," because I had been reading it now probably for that's almost a decade or so by myself. And I had this desire to say, okay, maybe because I was so into work and business that going to a study group didn't really make any sense. And that's when I decided. I said, look, Floyd, let's go to a group and let's read because we could probably really learn something. So we both decided to do that. I called the Brotherhood. I got the little booklet that they had, and John Bullock's name was in there. He was in Falls Church. It was just across the river. I was in Maryland at the time, and the rest is history. So, John was just a very pleasant guy, and he had recruited quite a few people. and most of them were from his operatic voice teaching, because he was a voice teacher by that time, and he had a place in Washington D.C. I suspect at that time his daughters were probably either in college or somewhere along the line, because we started, Floyd and I started going to Rita, at that time her name was Rita Northup, and we would show up every Tuesday. We couldn't wait for Tuesdays to come along, and we would just read straight through the book. Had lots of people come through that group. But to give you the quirks about John, John was a really interesting character. Like I said, he recruited quite a few people, and John would never read. He would sit. He would sit on the couch. He was kind of like like the king that would show up, and we'd give him a Rolling Rock, and he would sit there with a Rolling Rock beer, and he'd close his eyes and he'd listen to us reading, and would comment and talk, and be part of the conversation if we ever had a question or whatever. And he would straighten us out quite a bit. I have a little story about how he straightened how he straightened me out one time, which I think helped everybody else, that was there. So John, really didn't read, but you could see, I could see that he would have his feet up in the on the ottoman, and he would sit back, with his Rolling Rock beer, and obviously would comment and straighten us out, like I said. So one night, I think someone asked him, or they brought up, why are your legs wrapped so much? He had these big wrappings, and his shoes were these big black shoes that looked like boots almost. So he told us the story, and the story goes like this. He said, I had a tractor roll over my legs one day. I was up bush hogging, cutting grass on the side of my property out there in Virginia. I think it was in Virginia. I get whether it was Virginia, West Virginia, but I don't think that really makes a difference to the story right now. And he hit a rock or something, and it fell over and rolled over onto him. And he knew he was in really bad shape. He couldn't move his legs. He couldn't do anything. And he knew he was starting to pass out. So he started to do singing opera, and because he felt that if he could get enough oxygen into the body, he may not pass out. And he said, at some point, I saw these two little figures going back and forth. And just one more little context here. He was saying that he was out where there was a national park around him, so there was nobody close. At that time, there were no cell phones, and for some reason, the family expected him to be there another evening, so he knew he was in big trouble, very, very close to death. So as he was laying there, he did all of this breathing and singing and all the things that he taught to, get the opera singers to be able to bring in the oxygen and bring it out so that your voice can be projected. So at that moment, at some point, he said he saw these two figures. Well, actually more than two, I think, at the time. Some were small, no more than 2 or 3 feet tall, and others were very tall, 5, 6, 8 feet maybe. He's not exactly sure how tall they were, because the other 2 little guys were small. So he started hollering at him, and they completely ignored him, never looked at him, and they looked like they were just kind of moving things back and forth and readying. And he caught a glimpse of this silvery, almost looks like I'm going to say that he used the word cigar, or a cigar holder, and it had these big silvery flaps coming off it. So, to make the story a little bit shorter, he finally, he never passed out because he kept doing this. And he kept seeing these individuals that, he had no idea what they were. And of course, they ignored him. So he finally gets
Did he at the
rescued.
time, did he say anything more about what they looked like? Were they like, did they look like people, or more like they were angelic, or?
They looked more like people to him, because they were, at least that's the impression that I got from the way that he explained it, and that they were bipedal, and he could actually make out that they were that they're actually ambulatory.
Hmm.
At least that's the impression I got from it.
Yeah.
Of course, this is 30 some years later, but it did make a pretty big impression on my mind.
Yeah.
So I know I'm 90%, 95% close to the actual story that John told.
Yeah.
So he winds up in the hospital, and he said he was telling everybody about his experience, everybody from the family to friends, and someone comes in. I have no idea who this person was at this point, and this person brings a book. He says, "I know what you're talking about," and he showed him I'm going to give you the exact paper and section. It's paper 39, section 5, paragraphs 11 and 12. It may, I mean, if you want to read it now, I'd be willing to do it. Let's do that. These are the two paragraphs that are in the Urantia book that sold John on the fact that he knew that this was the right thing, because it explained exactly to him what he had seen. 39.5. Let me go there. Planetary helpers. It's the seraphic hosts. 39.5.11 start. Oh, now I got to put my glasses on. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do that right now. But I'm going to look this way so I can see the other screen. Your conventional idea of angels has been derived in the following way. During moments just prior to physical death, a reflective phenomenon sometimes occurs in the human mind. And this dimming consciousness seems to visualize something of the form of the attending angel, and this is immediately translated into terms of the habitual concept of angels held in that individual's mind. The erroneous idea that angels possess wings is not wholly due to olden notions that they must have wings to fly through the air. Human beings have sometimes been permitted to observe seraphim that were being prepared for transport service, and the traditions of these experiences have largely determined the Urantian concept of angels. In observing a transport seraphim being made ready to receive a passenger for interplanetary transit, there may be seen what are apparently double sets of wings extending from the head to the foot of the angel. In reality, these wings are energy insulators, friction shields. And it was when John read that he knew exactly those two paragraphs explained what he had seen, and that's what brought John into into then trying to recruit people
And becoming like a lifelong Urantia Book student. Wow.
Say again, Mike. I'm sorry.
Right. So he became a lifelong Urantia Book student based on that.
Yeah, all the way up until his death. I recall after he came back, he was Sandra's manager for quite a few years in the early 2000s or so, and we saw him at one point when he came back. I think we all got together, and he said that he was going to move back to Montgomery, Alabama, and in fact he did. Passed away in 2018 or so, but yeah, he managed all of her affairs. But the words that he said, I'm going to do everything every day for the revelation until I leave the planet. And yeah, I think that kind of impressed all of us, to say the least. But he was a very impressive guy. He had that commanding voice even when he wasn't singing opera.
Yeah, I didn't know he was a singer. Guy. I knew that he was a voice trainer, but it makes sense that he was a singer, but I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where he met his wife, Helga. One other quick story. Sandra was kind of moving into her career, and I'm guessing this was the late 80s. Google has her as in the first sitcom in 1990, and I remember it being a Canadian sitcom. And John brings in a little gray black and white TV with dog ears on it one night that we were going to read, and I was kind of disappointed because we weren't going to be reading, right? He says, "This is Sandy's first sitcom. This is her first show on TV," and he put the TV. We watched it. We so he could suspend the session anytime he wanted to. He was the king, to say the least.
Wow. So yeah, it was like you say it was his group, even though he didn't. It wasn't at his house.
Yeah, exactly.
And did you meet Helga much?
No, I think there was a time when someone asked John, does Sandra read? And he said, by osmosis. Oh, in fact, I do know when that was asked. I had recruited John to be one of the plenary speakers. We had 3 plenary speakers in the Art of Spiritual Living at Mount Vernon College in 1998 down here in DC. It was the only one that we ever did, in this area. And oh my gosh, was that a lot of planning time? Whew. A lot of people got involved from this area, and it went very well. But John was one of the plenary speakers, and I now that I kind of rings true. I did the emceeing for both Neil Waldrop and Preston Thomas. They were our plenary speakers, and John. Most of his talk was to get the book into the hands of as many people as you possibly can get. That was his theme. And I remember someone asking from the crowd, well, does Sandra read or does Helga read? And he says, by osmosis. That was his answer.
Yeah, I've heard that from some other people too. She gets it through osmosis or something like that. And I was trying to put it together because John Hales had talked about that he had seen him at a conference, which John was maybe helped to organize, which he thought was maybe in the 70s or quite a while earlier. But I don't. Yeah, it could be that he mixed up the dates. And then I've also heard that he was at a conference. When I looked it up, it was just across the river from New York City in New Jersey.
Oh, really? Okay.
But maybe, yeah, who knows? Maybe. I think that was actually the one that John Hales said that he thought he saw him at when, and he wasn't sure if maybe he had his daughters with him at that conference. But yeah, I would imagine that when Sandra, when Helga died, at least when Helga died, if not on other occasions, that Sandra would have at least become well acquainted with the Urantia Book's teachings on the afterlife and so forth, and probably that John would have wanted her to also be well aware of that before he died and things like that.
Yeah, take these off. Yeah, now I do have one other quick story, if I could pass that along. John was really well read and a very good student, and he understood things that we didn't understand, and he was bringing us along at times for some of the content. We were reading straight through the book. I remember we started in the beginning when Floyd and I first got there. So we were someplace in I'm kind of assuming it was in paper 115, 16, 17, where where it gets very philosophic and very cosmological, and start talking about the supreme being. And we were reading, and I remember it was me that asked a really dumb question, like, what are we talking about here? What's the supreme? What's all this stuff about? And I guess John had enough of me, because at that point he said, or all of us, I don't know. And he said, it's the first time he ever did this. He actually got up off the chair, and he said, and he's pointing down at the book, and he says, don't you know that we're creating a deity, each and every one of us, by everything that we do? And I remember turning over to my friend Floyd, and we looked at each other like, what's he talking about? Truthfully. And since then I've put together 3 articles, or three essays. 2 I presented up in the Chicago study session, called Crouching Deity, Hidden Supreme. And the reason for that title, it was suggested by Babs Murphy, by the way, and I thought it was just a really great suggestion, was that I don't really believe that the idea of a finite deity that's been downstepped from the infinite Father is something that is that's intuitive. Now, Charles Hartshorne and Alfred North Whitehead started moving in this direction. Hartshorne for sure. Alfred North Whitehead talks about the dipolar God, and that's where Charles Hartshorne went in and says that there's this finite aspect, and that's why Hartshorne came up with the 7 levels of perfection, which show up in the foreword. because without those 7 levels, you won't come up with the idea that that God, that the infinite, that the infinity of the infinitude, uh, has to be able to downstep himself enough for these things to happen. And I'm really talking at a very high level here. There's so much to learn about God, the supreme being. It's a study that's going to take place, I think, for the next 1,000 years before we even begin to take off the tip of the iceberg on that one. But that's what John did that one night. Somehow he got mad at us for not really understanding what we were reading. That was a very rare time, though. And it was such a big impression on me that, of course, that's why I said it really forced me to really start to take in a deeper look and say, uh-oh, how did I not know this, so to speak? I don't think it's self-evident. It's just something that is very difficult for us as typical humans thinking at the finite level to really understand that that's what's really going on here.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that was a story that I wanted to tell you, and I did write about that in I did tell that little story in one of the front pages of there, or I should say in the introduction, as to why I'm writing these papers, because I found out that I was pretty stupid about all this stuff.
And if he was so eager to give the book to many different people, I imagine, like when Sandra was making a movie with Keanu Reeves, or when she was dating Matthew McConaughey there in those kind of in the early years. And I mean, he must have crossed paths or had the opportunity to meet and work with and talk with, I imagine, so many people through Sandra and through his being CEO of her company and everything. But yeah, do you think he would have thought he wasn't? Yeah, do you think he would have been giving the book out quite like, well, you seem like a smart person, you should read this, or yeah, or do you think he was more like he wanted to develop a relationship with you first?
I think it's more that. Now this is where I sent an email to Rita to kind of ask that similar question. How much of success, because many of us had not very good success, and I'm certain that it was the approach that we took. But John seemed to have a very different approach, and from what I gather, it was an approach of gaining the confidence of an individual first, and not really dumping it on someone, quickly. You can't bang them over the head. All of us have found that out. That's just not going to work. And just like Jesus did when he was in Rome with the cynics and the other religious leaders, he let them talk, and then just applied truth so that the truth could crowd out some of the erroneous things that they were doing. That's a very hard thing to do. You don't do that right away. But John, I'm pretty sure, and I'll get back to you on that one, is I think had that one down pretty good. That was some of what he talked about when he did the plenary talk at the Art of Spiritual Living down there in DC, as to how to kind of approach those sorts of things. And I'm pretty sure
You said 1998 in wow.
Yeah, seems like yesterday for me, but it's what, 28 years, 27 years ago, 26 years
And you said
ago.
it was at a college there,
Mount Vernon.
Mount Vernon. Yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame it's not recorded, or as
Right.
probably many other. I mean, not just because he was such an interesting person, but and did he ever tell you about this story about how oh yeah, he found it in the hospital. So he must have been the one who introduced it to this other really renowned voice trainer, Tony Tamburello, because yeah, I had heard that one of them had introduced the other.
When you brought that up to me on the phone, I kind of suspected that that's who brought the book into him in the in the hospital.
Okay.
Now, so that would have implied that Tony had probably come across the person, was pretty well. And maybe if Tony wasn't a real believer that this is the full truth about the cosmology of the universe. I think after he heard John's story and what happened to John, he probably would have.
Uh-huh. Do
Interesting
you
how
know,
those things happen.
do you know around what year that might have been that he got introduced to the book?
Wow. No, I really don't. I'd be taking a stab at it.
Mm.
We wound up with John in 1982, 83, somewhere around there. So I'm suspecting I would have to talk to Rita Northup to really get the date on that. She could estimate it for me. It was certainly before that because John had recruited, all these other folks, Babs Murphy and Rita Northup and a whole host of others. We had, over the years, we had probably 100 different folks came through that study session
Wow.
because people came into DC, like Betsy Engstrom. She wound up in the Pentagon. This was during the first Iraq War, and she was a photographer and took pictures. She was the one that was doing satellite pictures, and she couldn't tell us much about it, of course, and never
Wow.
did.